All right, guys, so this week at Snapshot, we kept going in our series of who do you say he is? Asking the question, who do you think Jesus is, right? Is he just a moral teacher? Is he a guy that actually existed? Is he just a legend? Or was he really the Son of God? Was he God here in the flesh? And we looked last week at how Jesus definitely thought in his own words that he was everything that he said he is, right? Like that he thought he was the Son of God, that he was God in the flesh, that he would come back from the dead. Like he thought and believed all these things completely. Now the question is, did other people believe this about him? Right? And I think the answer is yes, because we're still talking about him today, which means enough people kept talking about it because they believed it that we're still talking about it. But we'll look at that, right? So there are some accounts in the Bible. We're not going to read through all these, but I'm going to give you the Bible references, and you can check them out, and they'll be in the description too. So if you don't get them, we look at Thomas, the famous guy who doubted that Jesus came back from the dead. One of the disciples, the guys who followed him around, was like, you know what? That's too crazy to believe. Like, even though I followed this guy around, I've seen him do miracles, I've heard him teach, like, he didn't come back to life. Nobody comes back to life, right? And then he sees it and he exclaims, my Lord and my God, right? That's what he calls Jesus after he sees Jesus come back to life, right? That's his, what he says. And that story is found in John chapter 20, around verses 25 through 28. And then in Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20, the disciple Peter, this is where he gets his name, Peter. His name before is Simon, but Jesus calls him Peter, which means rock. Because he's one of the first disciples that gets it, and he proclaims that Jesus is, yes, the Messiah. And then if you read in John chapter 11, just kind of read that whole thing, but in John chapter 11, verse 27, Martha, one of Jesus's dear friends, says, Jesus, I've always believed that you're the Messiah, right? And then at the beginning of the book of John, chapter 1, verse 49, read again around it, but one of his disciples, followers, Nathanael, says, you are the Lord, like you are the Messiah, right? And then the last one that we looked at was 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 7, where Paul, the guy who used to persecute Christians and kill them, then became a Christian. And he writes that he believes all these things about Jesus, that he lived, he did these miracles, he died, he came back to life, that he is God in the flesh, right? He believes these things. So, all these things come from the Bible, though. So, if people just wanted to make up a religion for us to follow, they obviously would write stuff that said what they believed, so people would listen to it and follow it, right? So how can we trust the Bible? That's one of the biggest questions that we as Christians have to answer, right? And if people aren't Christians, that hopefully they try and answer it and don't just believe that it's hooey patooey without checking it, right? Without ever reading it, without ever testing it. So what are some of the ways we can test the Bible? We looked at three main ways that you could test the Bible. One is the biographical evidence test, which just means how many copies of the original documents do we have, or when are the earliest copies made, and how consistent are they, right? What's the time interval between those copies? So thinking about that, the Bible is the most historically, I think, accurate book in this regard that passes this test, right? There are over 7,000 copies that are incredibly early. So the Bible was probably written around 50 to 100, the New Testament, 50 to 100 AD, right? That's when all the stuff was written. If it was written after that, the people who put the Bible together and say this is what Christians should look at and read got rid of it because they're like, it's not firsthand account evidence and we don't want to read it because it'll mess people up. Like, we just want the people who were there and saw these things happen to do it. So in that, looking at the biographical evidence, all of the stuff that we read in our history books actually comes from works that were written by people that were copied much later. So the earliest copies we have of most of the works that we base our history books on are almost 500 years after what the original writing was, and some of them over 1,000 years. And we still trust those to base our history off of, which is an amazing, amazing thing to think about that. But we don't question those, right? People aren't like, well, I don't believe that Caesar really wrote that. Like, yeah, right? But when it comes to the Bible, it has this incredibly close timeline of when stuff was written and when there were copies made, and there's tons more copies of the Bible than any other work of antiquity ever. The second thing we looked at is something called the internal evidence test, which just says that you cannot come to any work of history or writing and look at it, and before you read it, say that you don't believe it or trust it. That's not a fair way or objective way to look at something. So it says you have to actually read the document and look at it and see if there's internal consistency, meaning did they use the same kinds of words and phrases over and over, or is there something that's like really out of place? And also, is that wording, phrasing consistent with other works of the time? Is that how people talked and wrote at that time? Yes, if so, good. If not, then maybe there's something fishy and somebody added something later, right? As long as the words and types of words and phrases are consistent, and the document doesn't contradict itself in the things that it says, like it makes this claim and then later it says, no, this happened, then you have to trust that whatever the writing is, it might not be absolutely true, but it is true in the fact that that's what the person perceives that they saw, and that's what they wrote down, right? So that's the internal consistency test. And then the last one is the external evidence test. It checks for the consistency inside the document, but it checks it against other things outside of the document, right? It uses other histories, other works of that time to check and make sure that that is accurate. And looking at the Bible, there are a lot of other histories that were written that talk about Christianity and what Christians did, and that Christians believe that they were worshiping Jesus as God, and that they believe he came back to life, that he died and came back to life. And there are also tons of early church fathers who wrote things that spoke to the deity of Christ, that said, no, we believe Jesus was here as God in flesh, human being, walked around, got killed, came back to life. That's all that stuff. There were tons of people who wrote that within the first 100 years. So a generation and 2 generations after Jesus. So people who say, well, Christians, that stuff got all made up later and kind of messed up. No, it didn't. If you read that Corinthians verse we talked about earlier from Paul, it's from the very first. That's what the church was saying. Jesus was God in flesh, died, rose again, came back to life, ascended into heaven. And the next 2 generations said the exact same thing, and Christians have been saying the exact same thing since then. So if we look at some of these external evidences and the internal evidence, and plus the biographical evidence of how many copies we have and when they were written, the Bible, the New Testament, has an amazing track record that is unparalleled with any other historical document. And if you want some more information about some of those internal and external evidences and some of those names, come talk to me and I'll give them to you. One of the other things we talked about was even the writers of the Gospels or in the New Testament, some of the letters, wrote that they believed that they were saying, this is a true account that I'm saying. John in his gospel writes, this report is from an eyewitness giving an accurate account. He speaks the truth so that you may also continue to believe. That's in John 19:35. Luke, at the beginning of his gospel, writes this, many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. That means like people have already used what's been going around to write what's been happening about Jesus, right? Like people have been using the stories that have been going around to write stuff. And he says, having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write you an account, most honorable Theophilus. So Luke is actually writing this to a person so that you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. All right, so Luke goes around and systematically looks at all of these stories and checks them out and makes sure he believes them, and then he writes down his account of Jesus's life, right? Like he was a guy who was looking for truth back then, so he could write the most accurate account he could. And then 2 Peter 1, we were going to read 16 through 21 was kind of what we read, but I'll just read part of it. And it says, for we are not making up clever stories when we told you about the powerful coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We saw his majestic splendor with our own eyes when he received honor and glory from God the Father. The voice from the majestic glory of God said to him, this is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. We ourselves heard that voice from heaven when we were with him on the holy mountain, talking about an experience they had called the Transfiguration. Check it out. Right? But Peter's like, we saw these amazing things with our own eyes, and we believe it. And we'll talk a little more this coming week about how we can trust that Jesus' resurrection was really real. So make sure you come and check that out. And if you have any questions, please ask them, because this is some of the most important stuff that we can actually have trust and faith in, not just faith like blind faith, but like trust because there are some facts to back it up. what we believe in the Bible is true.